4 жовтня.
The 4th of October, Media Center Ukraine, Ukrinform still continues its work. My name is Svetlana Necheparenko, and right now we are going to present an analytical report concerning how to bring back the deported Ukrainians from the Russian Federation home. So this is taking place within the framework of Media Center Brain Hub. The participants of our today's event is Onisia, Sinyuk, the legal analyst for the ZMINA Center for Human Rights, Alyona Lunyova, the director of Advocacy at the ZMINA Center for Human Rights, and Kateryna Rashevska, an expert at the Regional Center for Human Rights. So, Ms. Onisia, let's start the conversation with you. Could you kindly tell us more about this report, the data it contains, and could you kindly share how many Ukrainians have been deported by the Russians, how many are adults and children amongst them, and what is the geography of deportation? ZMINA and other organizations, which is part of our coalition Ukrainian 5 o'clock, have been working for a long time with the issue of deportation. We have been searching through these issues for a long time because we know that at least it's started with a full-scale invasion, and at maximum it even continues even longer. When talking about numbers, this is one of the most complicated issues to tackle because we understand that Ukraine and the Ukrainian authorities have no access to the occupied territories nor to the Russian Federation territory, and the Russian Federation in its turn is not providing us with the necessary information. Of the information that we have available, in October 2022, the following numbers were articulated: about 2 million Ukrainians deported. The Russian Federation in its turn also speaks about a variety of different numbers. Even when we talk about exceptionally the spring of 2022, within that period 2 different numbers are vocalized by official sources of the Russian Federation. First it was 5.4 million Ukrainians. In a month it was 3.5 million Ukrainians, and there was no explanation as to why there was such a disparity between the numbers, but the civil society in Russia, according to their examination, also claimed that these numbers are not reliable, and especially in the context of the deported, because they simply speak in favor of the number of the crosses of the Ukrainian and Russian border. So how many Ukrainians crossed the Ukrainian border to enter the Russian Federation. So this does not necessarily speak in favor of these people being the deported, and we don't know how many of these people have chosen to stay in the Russian Federation, because many people chose to go through the Russian Federation in order to go away from Russia to the third countries, because unfortunately there was no opportunity for them to get back to the Ukrainian-controlled territories. When we talk about the number of the deported children from Ukraine, it is being updated on the portal The Children of War, being administered by the state authorities of Ukraine, and these are only the children that the authorities in Ukraine are aware of. So this number is not final. Right now it's more than 19,000 children deported, but once again this is not the final number. When talking about how these people and where they were placed after their deportation to the territory of the Russian Federation, of course these were temporary places of placement. At the peak time, there were 150 different points in 59 different regions of Russia, and we have to be conscious that people were not placed in the closest regions to the border. These people were temporarily placed in those regions, and then as fast as they could, they tried to distribute them across different different territories. For example, some of them, the volunteers said that in Taganrog railway station, some trains would come, and at the time the trains would leave. Even the personnel and the volunteers wouldn't know where the trains would go. So the people were in the dark. They didn't have a choice. They completely were not informed about where they were being sent. Besides, we have to understand the condition that these people were in addition to being violated and abused as a result of deportation. They were lacking funds, and more often than not, they didn't have even any documents to get back to Ukraine or ensure their leaving for third countries. And even when we talk about a short stay in Russia, it's all about impossibility to provide for oneself in financial terms, because even getting employment in the Russian Federation, you need to have certain contacts with the Russian law enforcers, and people, of course, were reluctant to go for that. And this restricted their opportunities for finding employment or getting any assistance, because they would have to get in touch with the authorities, sign some documents, which people were very much unwilling to do. Therefore, these people are very much restricted in their financial resources. When talking about children, the situation is even more complex, because these are the individuals who, in essence, are heavily restricted in terms of travel unassistedly. They require caretakers, and the Russian Federation is taking advantage of this situation. In addition to changes to be introduced to the legislation with reference to the Ukrainian children in particular, the Russian Federation did everything in order to place these children immediately in children care institutions or immediately in the Russian families without even looking for the relatives of these children, or even if they knew there were relatives available, they would block any contacts for these children to get back to their family relatives. Thank you. Ms. Alyona, I would like to ask you about the possibilities to get back adult population back to Ukraine. So what are some of the obstacles? Hello, colleagues. Actually, after 1.5 years since the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we have to understand how the citizens of Ukraine who are in the territory of the Russian Federation can still get back to Ukraine or go to third countries, because it's also one of the pathways which is being utilized heavily by Ukrainians, because if they have their identification or documents, they can still leave the Russian Federation and go to third countries. However, unfortunately, if at the beginning of the new phase of the war, the countries bordering on the Russian Federation would allow Ukrainians without imposing any additional restrictions, even sometimes based on the copies of their official documents, sometimes even without documents, we know about different such cases. So these European countries in the first place would allow our fellow citizens, even if they had difficulties with documents. Whereas now the situation has changed, and we are getting more and more information about the Ukrainians not being allowed to Poland, Estonia. So we know about the instances when even the people affected who have been to occupied territories, who have been in captivity in the occupied territories, especially men, find it very difficult to leave the Russian Federation's territory to the third countries, because if the third countries, our foreign partners, do not allow men to enter their territory for some invalid reasons, can unfortunately be fraught with various difficulties for the fellow citizens of Ukraine, like restriction of freedom, imprisonment, or torture. So in the European legislation, there has to be not the presumption that Ukrainians have to be allowed into their territories, but they have to be telling the Ukrainians leaving the Russian Federation, they have to be asking them more about what was happening to them in the territory of the Russian Federation and why they are willing to leave. The second question is the return of the Ukrainians from the Russian Federation to Ukraine, because as of now, there is a checkpoint between the Russian and Ukrainian border. We, as the Ukrainian state, still allow the Ukrainians to get back to Ukraine. There is one cross point, checkpoint, and even if individuals don't have their identification documents, just copies, it just so happens that these people can be allowed into the territory of Ukraine. Doesn't happen very frequently. Unfortunately, a lot of Ukrainians have been in the occupied territories in the Russian Federation without any documents validating their identity. It's another challenge, because last year Ukraine implemented an experiment of returning documents, identification of these individuals. So if these individuals are abroad and they go to the consulates in Ukraine, in Russia, there are no such consulates. The Migration Service of Ukraine took upon itself the responsibility to make these documents and release them. This year, more than 70 such documents have been released. These documents released in Ukraine and via different volunteering organizations being forwarded to the territory of the Russian Federation. With the help of these IDs and documents, people are getting back to Ukraine, or they can leave Russia and go to the third countries. The only thing is that in November this year, this experiment is running out, and we don't know whether it will continue in the same format or some things will be improved, some things will be changed, because unfortunately the residents in the occupied territories were not covered by this process. It's a highly dynamic process because the Russians are trying to seal this territory. They are trying to prevent Russians leaving. They're trying to prevent Ukrainians leaving the Russian territory if the latter ones have no documents. So in order to get saved, Ukrainians have to be released with a passport. Otherwise, they cannot cross this checkpoint, although it's not the border, but this is the bordering line on the Russian Federation. And we understand that we are keenly aware that it's extremely difficult for these people to live in the territories where Ukrainians can reside without documents. So I very much hope that when in November or before November the government reconsiders this experiment, we will have a particular procedure in place to issue such citizens of our country who are in the occupied territories with some documents. Another category that is very difficult to deal with, these are the ones that are coming back and they have never had their identification of the Ukrainian citizens. Most of the time these are young people of the occupied territories, occupied for more than 10 years, Crimea and separate areas of Donetsk and Lugansk regions. They can enter the territory controlled by the Ukrainian government, and they cannot get out of those territories in any other way but through Ukraine. So in this respect, we can say that the government is not leaving them unattended, because people without documents, even if they go through the interviews at the border to be allowed the entry of Ukraine, still living without documents in Ukraine for several months is very hard. So the state of Ukraine supports such citizens. They can be placed in collective centers for IDPs, and they can gain different kind of humanitarian and legal support provided by the partners, not issued by the state, but with the facilitation of the Ukrainian state. And it's very important to provide such people with the systemic, consistent support. And overall, for the deported coming back to Ukraine, it's extremely necessary to provide them with the documents. We need to go through special interviews with them, learn what has been the matter with them, and support them in getting issued with documents. This is critical for the time of wartime. The government needs to support them because in addition to housing and residence, people also have to be supported during the months when they are waiting to be issued with documents. Ms. Kateryna, getting the Ukrainian children back is a painful issue. Getting every child back to Ukraine, it's a victory for both the state and every organization involved in these mechanisms. So can you kindly tell us about the mechanisms, our country and other countries implementing these mechanisms, and what are the challenges that we are faced with, because the children cannot make their own independent decisions of getting back to Ukraine, so we need to apply these results. As of now, if we are guided by the information on platform The Children of War in Ukraine via the efforts of NGOs, coupled by government authorities, 386 children have been brought back. So these are the children who were illegally deported to the Russian Federation and forcibly detained or transported to the Russian-controlled territories. Every time it's an individual case because the Russian Federation are putting up a lot of resistance, and these obstacles vary depending on the child, on the status of this child, whether this child is an orphan or deprived of parental care. This also heavily depends whether this child has already been imposed the Russian citizenship on. This can also do with where the child hails from, because some of these children have been witnesses of violations and crimes committed by the Russian military, and therefore, of course, they are of great value for the Russian Federation, and they are very much reluctant to get them back to Ukraine. Also, the Russian Federation, via their different officials, repeatedly say that orphans and those deprived of parental care, children will be brought back to Ukraine under special conditions. In the first place, it will never be guided by the competent bodies of Ukraine. This will be always be guided by the decisions issued by the new heads of like Pasechniks, Pushilins. They will be in charge of making such decisions. Also, Maria Lvova-Belova, before this statement, had said that these children are not detainees, and once they are out of age, they will simply cross the border if they wish to, and they will continue living in the territory of Ukraine. Amongst the obstacles that we have in place, it's the reluctance to recognize the documents issued by the competent authorities of Ukraine. Especially this is true for the documents issued after the full-scale invasion began. Unfortunately, there is quite often a procedure when, due to the situation when, because of shelling caused by the Russian Federation, a mother dies, the only official caretaker of the child. Now, after the full-scale invasion, her sister or another relative can become the caretaker of this child and be issued with the necessary documentation. So the Russians can require from these relatives to go through a DNA test. We had a case when a granny was trying to get her child back, and she had to wait for 1 month for the DNA conclusion. And Maria Lvova-Belova said that this was streamlining the procedure, and they did this expert analysis at their own expense. Also, there are some different cases when they force us to reissue documents for caretaking, and in order to draw up these documents according to the Russian Federation about care and caregiving, this individual, as the caretaker, will have to become the Russian citizen. So you have to be issued with a Russian passport, and then you will have to draw up the documents on taking care of the child. So because our lawyers are very savvy, as a rule, they work with the NGOs and local authorities, so they specifically put up the blunt questions. So after we are issued with the Russian citizenship, can we leave the occupied territories of Ukraine? In return to that, in Kherson and Zaporizhia regions, their occupying authorities immediately tell them, no, you cannot. So you have two options. Either you reunite with the child and stay in the occupied territory, or you can never be reunited with your child, and you have to stay in the occupied territory, and the child remains in the Russian Federation. So we have the contacts with Maria Lvova-Belova, and all of these 386 cases, in one way or another, were communicated via her office, not directly, because the Ukrainian authorities are not in direct contact with Maria Belova's office, no matter how hard she's trying to depict it exactly like that. We have also enjoyed challenges because of the pressure exerted on the children, which is pretty much like war crimes or crimes against humanity. Some of the parents, it was illegal detention and legal imprisonment. Some of these parents were detained by different law enforcers. Then they were put on balaclavas on their heads. They were kept in basements, interrogated for a long time in order to identify the information about the network of the organizations who are involved in bringing the children back. This is another challenge. If you discredit, liquidate, or block, cause obstructions, in the opinion of the Russian Federation, no return of the children is possible. It's not just because they do not like Save Ukraine or SOS Children's Towns, Ditachi Mistechka. They are doing everything they can in order to block the return of children. There were also forcible stripping of clothes when children were forced to get stripped of clothes to underwear, and they were also videotaped. and children were forced to take all of their belongings out of the bag, and just wearing underpants, these children would have to name what exactly was in the content of this bag, and then this child was beaten on the legs, and just because there was a sudden check taking place, not having to do anything to do with the deportation of the child was released. So we can talk long about these cases of 386 children coming back, but not a single time has a thing that Lvova Belova speaks about, facilitating the return of the minors, has taken place, although they have been trying to ensure that, of course, in inverted commas, for a long time. So at first, they set up different HQs in partnership with DNR and LNR, People's Republics, seemingly tried to help the children, and as they report, they managed to find relatives for 16 children of 9 families. In fact, we know at least about two families who have managed to find their own children. Due to the partnership with NGOs, they were able to bring their kids back. And then Lvova Belova, in her bulletin that she, by the way, deleted from her site, she claimed that she facilitated the reunification of the families. Now this number is amending and changing just as many times as we mentioned her arrest warrant. And the Russian Federation says that this is only complicating the process of unifying families. They never explained why. Now they have the rationale. Ostensibly, parents and legal representatives are afraid of reaching out to Maria Lvova Belova because she is a suspect. In fact, if someone is afraid to reach out to Maria Lvova Belova, it's not for the reason that she is a suspect by the ICC, but because she is afraid to be confronted with all of those things that I have already mentioned about the obstacles and obstructions caused by the Russian Federation. So what are we to do? How can we protect children from repeat traumas, and how can we prevent violation of the rights of their legal representatives? We need a single legal mechanism to bring the Ukrainian children back, regardless of the fact that they are in a vulnerable situation, that they are minors and juveniles. So in no way are we saying that this mechanism is right only for children and civil prisoners, let them stay in Russia, because still they have this possibility, the chance of crossing the border by themselves. No, this mechanisms of getting the children back, let's put it bluntly and diplomatically, right now it's much easier to promote this mechanism for children because children is a sensitive topic and there is a greater keen interest in that. I will very quickly describe it. If you have any more detailed questions about how to ensure this mechanism, you can proceed with that. So this mechanism needs to be approved by the General Assembly of the UN to oblige the Russian Federation and the countries participating in the Geneva Convention to be obliged to repatriate all of the civilians who were so-called evacuated. So this is the obligation which is connected with the international humanitarian law and children's rights. On the basis of this resolution, an individual approach will be obliged. We cannot put children in buses, as was done by the Russian Federation when they deported them, or on trains and take them goodness knows where. There should be an individual trajectory of return for these children developed. Also the measures for their further rehabilitation and reintegration. And with reference to every child, individual interests and needs will have to be assessed, where the children will have to get back, whether they will have to be institutionalized, and then at the consent of the child, whether they will have to be forwarded to a Ukrainian family. After the approval of this convention by the efforts of Ukraine and unfortunately Russia, the third party will have to be appointed that will be not just the middleman, but also the guarantor of the future agreement to be concluded in the format of the grain deal. I understand all of the skepticism about the grain deal that you have, but let me remind you that for a long period of time it was operational, and this is the only operative instrument that we have available. And Maria Lvova Belova or other representatives of the Russian regime, Moskalkova, for example, cannot conclude any contracts or agreements. Otherwise, this will just discredit all of our efforts to describe this regime and recognize it at the level of the Council of Europe, NATO, and the EU. We cannot conclude any agreements with the terrorists and hope that they will deliver on their promises in the sensitive area of bringing back children. So it looks really awkward. So after these conclusions of agreements, this will be a group return of children, and parents, legal representatives of children, will not have to be forced to go to the Russian Federation and be tortured. So this mechanism will allow for children to be brought back to Ukraine faster, and it will not take 52 years, as it unfortunately is the case, but in a few years. And this mechanism has to include all the children who had the status of a child at the time of their forcible removal or illegal deportation. Otherwise, we will just leave part of these children in a highly vulnerable situation. Boys, for example, who will be forcibly mobilized, for example, and in line with the Russian legislation, they cannot cross the border right now because they still have this duty to pay to the Russian Federation imposed on them together with the Russian citizenship through. And now we can move on to the questions. Another question to Ms. Kateryna concerning the children that have already been brought to Ukraine. Are they getting any support, mental in the first place? And how is this process taking place after their return? Regarding the rehabilitation, reintegration, and financial support issuance, I'll be frank with you. The state is working on establishing these programs. We know some initiatives at the Human Rights Commissioner level and at the level of the Ministry of Reintegration. At the same time, different NGOs are busy dealing with such rehabilitation measures. I'm not going to condemn this practice because, in fact, being aware of the scale of the problem to do with children, these organizations can assume this responsibility. They're very well equipped, and I think it looks optimum in terms of the resources. However, this practice obviously cannot be spread to the thousands of children who have to be brought back with the help of this single mechanism. Concerning the financial payments, you know, I already see Alyona's face, and I think that she is ready to comment more on the status of the child obtainable by these children, and that this respective status will only provide for hot meals at school, but not financial remuneration. Quite often we had children reaching out to us, being in a very difficult physical condition, and while we were looking for the ways to bring them back, these children were looking for money to go and buy themselves some food. I'm not over-exaggerating, it's true. So in order to help these children who are already in Ukraine, quite recently, when we were at a conference in Rzeszów, Poland, we had a meeting with an executive director of the Survivors Fund under the umbrella of the International Criminal Court, and they're very much interested to develop financial support programs for rehabilitation of these children, even before conviction for Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova have been passed. This will be unprecedented because, first of all, in order not to violate the presumption of innocence, because there is no conviction for these two individuals and they haven't been recognized criminals, but we have different details of the Russian central bank. Not only Russian assets can be used and utilized for the sake of helping the Ukrainian children. We're working on it. So the return of children is a very important target, but these children cannot be deserted anywhere and return them to no one knows where, to frontal area. It's not okay, although unfortunately we have such instances. Thank you. Maybe Alyona, you have something to add about children and tell something about rehabilitation and reintegration of the adults. A very brief answer concerning adults: no rehabilitation to be provided to the adults. Concerning children, from my perspective, it would be necessary to develop an intersectoral protocol of actions, because if a child crosses the border of Ukraine, coming back to Ukraine, we have to clearly understand who's responsible for what, because a lot is being done by volunteering organizations, NGOs, who bring the children here, place them in their own hubs that they support and uphold themselves. But the first question that we can come up with, where will these children live together with these parents? Because more often than not, these people come from the occupied territories. Another thing is document issuance, rehabilitation, and the rest that Kateryna has already mentioned. So it's important for the government to legalize all of these things. Money always is a matter, but there are not too many children right now for the country to mismanage this affair. So this intergovernmental protocol needs to exist in action, because every single time it's like a quest where to find money just to buy food, buy clothing, because a lot of children were brought back in summer. Now it's autumn time and we need to buy them some warm clothing. A lot of NGOs simply take this money out of their pockets. Quite often these are sympathetic families, but this is not the case it's supposed to be if the government, if the state claims that it is responsible for them. So there needs to be a special procedure ensured. Whether these will be targeted programs or non-financial assistance that will be targeted in its approach. And rehabilitation is another important matter. Kateryna has said it very aptly. While not too many children are coming back to Ukraine, this procedure needs to be installed, because when it's hundreds and thousands of children coming back, we will be running out of time to develop procedures or to implement them. And the matter of identification of children all the way to where we will place them, which schools they will go to, who will take care of them, especially the children older than 16. These may be status children, but they have to be kept somewhere. Quite often they're deserted, they're left alone, which means that if there is a difficult situation, children are left deplorable, and this is not the way it should be. At the point when the financial support needs to be issued, predominantly all the people of these legal representatives, these are IDPs or people coming from the temporarily occupied territories, according to Save Ukraine. Just to bring one child back, it takes $2,000 to $3,000 additional for the caretaker. So you can imagine how big the money is. In addition, we had one case when one father tried to get back his two children. Of course, local lawyers had to be involved, and he had to invest $7,000. These people simply don't have this money. So this financial support issued by the state needs to start all the way when the people say, I want to get my children back, claiming, I will go and I'll do all I can, but because these are your citizens, you're obliged to take care of them, so please do issue me with some money. And one more thing I would like to underscore is that we are in a unique situation. Money is there, and a lot. Money is not a problem in this case. We have a special package of financial support for children envisaged by different European Union assistance packages, and the resolution which also revolved around the issues of forcible deportations has a point which says that the European Union is ready to issue money for Ukraine for the sake of rehabilitation and return of these children. The US have repeatedly claimed, please reach out, we will fund these programs for the return, rehabilitation and reintegration of these children. So these countries are in every way possible to get involved and help. Like I said, this idea of trust fund is already there and it can be processed and applied. So just saying that we have needs, we have the active phase of hostilities, and children will take away food from the soldiers or for armor. These are all manipulations and all about reluctance to help, because there is money and this has nothing to do with military assistance. Thank you, dear journalists. Do you have any questions to our panelists? Yana Molyshenko, Ukrinform. I have a question to Ms. Alyona. You said that there is only one checkpoint via which it's possible to go back to Ukraine. What is this checkpoint? Do you have any data? How much people have already crossed it? Yes, it's in Sumy region. Kolotelivka Pokrovka is its name. And via this checkpoint, Ukrainian citizens are coming back. The number of returns is growing because all of the citizens who are troubled because of documents cannot get back to Ukraine, cannot go to Belarus or the third countries because they don't have documents. Because previously people with document problems would frequently go to Demograna de Lunyova in Belarus. So we had these two windows to get the Ukrainian citizens back. Let me underscore, these checkpoints do not allow people to leave Ukraine, only enter Ukraine. How many citizens? At least 100 a day, and this number is growing, I think, just because of the policy of forcible passportization policy implemented by the Russian Federation. It just forces the Ukrainians to come back to Ukraine. Russians have recently closed this checkpoint for a while, and this created a huge problem because people are not very mobile. Once again, they cannot get back to Ukraine via any other checkpoints. Therefore, near this checkpoint, there are some hubs where people can stay overnight, where they can get hot meals and have showers. There are volunteering organizations working around this checkpoint, and they help to house the people who are leaving the territory of the Russian Federation. And the Ministry of Reintegration has also introduced evacuation train. It works every 2 or 3 days, and special payments are also issued to the people who get evacuated. So in fact, when these people get back to the Ukrainian controlled territories, they're immediately issued with the governmental financial support. This is extremely important. This hasn't always been the case, and we are getting to see that the number of these people is growing due to the politics implemented by the Russian Federation against Ukrainians in the occupied territories. Thank you. Next question, please.
What cooperation is coming from international partners besides the funding, which is good news, but are there demands being made from any part of the international community about children, especially? And if so, are there any brokers that are helping with those negotiations? Дякую.
Have like 2 dimensions of such cooperation. One of them is the vector of accountability. As you know, there is a joint investigation team and also state members of the ICC. So they are willing and they are ready to support efforts of Ukrainian bodies and also of the ICC and other states who are working on this principle of universal jurisdiction to help us to prosecute people who are guilty when we're talking about unlawful deportation, forcible transfer, and also today unreasonable delay in repatriation of Ukrainian children. And the second dimension of this cooperation is the process of repatriation of Ukrainian children. So how we can return them, what is the mechanism, what should they do. For example, my organization, we obtained several requests from mission of foreign states in the United Nations who are ready to be the third party in order to mediate the process of repatriation of Ukrainian children. Unfortunately, I can't tell you who are these people and what states because of some security and other issues. However, we have elaborated the algorithm of their actions, how they can deal with this issue and what should they do in order to establish contacts with the Ukrainian mission, also with the Russian Federation mission in the United States, with competent bodies in Ukraine and also who are competent bodies in the Russian Federation, and other steps. We have elaborated even the draft resolution of the United Nations General Assembly in order just to submit it to the third committee of the General Assembly, then to vote it as soon as possible, and then to establish a unified mechanism of repatriation. And as you know, several months ago, the foreign policy published information that Ukraine and Russia started the process of negotiation through third parties, through Arabia Saudite or Turkey, in order to create such a mechanism and to repatriate Ukrainian children. The Russian Federation did not confirm such an information. However, the process is ongoing. So these are two main dimensions. Of course, inside these dimensions, there are some initiatives related to rehabilitation and reintegration of Ukrainian children. Many states, they are really interested in how Ukraine will reintegrate children from, for example, DPR and LPR and also Crimea, because they were under occupation during 9 years. That is why they need special programs of reintegration, and of course we know it, and our competent bodies also know that maybe for these children we need not reintegration programs but integration programs. However, this is not the case when we should accept some territorial concessions or accept the fact that these are Russian children just not to face these problems. So there are like a coalition of states who are ready to support us, and inside this coalition there are not only the so-called friends of Ukraine, European Union countries, United States and so on, but also such states like Rwanda and other African states, because for them this is humanitarian initiative, not political. This is not about punish Putin and Lvova Belova when we are talking about repatriation, but only mostly about reunification of families and return of children in vulnerable position, like children orphans and children deprived of parental care. On an other side, there are also Guatemala, Costa Rica, and other Latin America states who are ready also to do their best in order to help Ukrainian children affected by this crisis.
Ще запитання?
Any more questions? Alexandra Kulbaba, Fifth Channel, 2 questions to Kateryna. You have named big numbers. You have identified the men who has spent $7,000. What does this money go for? What is it meant for? This is question 1. And secondly, could you expand in greater detail, step by step, this mechanism of getting the children back? For the most part, this money is necessary in order to ensure that one of the individuals, in the case of the father, it wasn't the father, and due to the reasons you understand, it was his mother, the child's mother. So first the mother went and she stayed in the Russian Federation for a month, and she had to leave and provide for herself, find food. Then he had to send his brother to the mother of those children who had lived in the occupied territory of the Russian Federation in Crimea. So he went to support the mother in her efforts because it was a torture on part of the Russian authorities. Next, they had to go for the Russian lawyer to participate in numerous procedures organized by different parental care institutions who were trying to stop and block and obstruct the return of these children. Of course, I'm not going to go into greater detail what the money can go to, because there are some things that we cannot articulate, but we still have to be aware that sometimes the Russian Federation asks for the production of documents. First of all, you have to cross the border with the documents of the citizen of Ukraine, and of course you have to pay for that, but this is the harmless way of spending your money. So this money, of course, doesn't drop out of the blue. This is the money that substantively has to be paid, and Ms. Alyona has already said that clothing needs to be bought. Sometimes we get back children in December, and they wear sandals because the parents in the Russian Federation couldn't buy boots for this child and send him to Ukraine. So there are extra costs incurred. Concerning the mechanism of return, there was a good question. Which of the mechanisms do you mean? I can tell you about the mechanism which was developed by the Regional Center of Human Rights with the support of the member of the coalition, Save the Children Partnership, and numerous other children's organizations, so-called, that have the respective experience. This is an exclusively international mechanism, and it is supposed to be underpinned by the conclusion of agreements between Ukraine and the third country or the third party, not a middleman or the country providing you with good services any definition that exists right now in the international humanitarian law puts some restrictions on this format. So the format for this third party to exercise its functions by, once again, it's up to this third party and Russia. I have to underscore, because without the involvement of the Russian Federation, we'll never be able to return our children back to Ukraine. So it's only possible if there is the collapse of the military might of the Russian Federation in the battlefield. In other cases, just because we are short of time, we have to cooperate with Russia. So all of these international agreements will have obligations specifically for Ukraine, specifically for Russia, and specifically for the third party that will be the middleman to set the contacts between the respective parties and also participate in the development of the agreements and be a guarantor. It's not just to be a guarantor and say, oh, the Russia violates something or Ukraine violates something, oops, but the guarantor will be the party. When everything is functioning well, this party will be monitoring everything and providing its assessment what works and what not, and is very quick in its response. And if something is failing, it proactively begins to accumulate and spur all of the international parties into action. I know that a lot of questions can ensue. Why does the Russian Federation have to agree to comply with this mechanism and agreements, etc.? But in fact, what we see is that the Russian Federation is already trying to demonstrate efforts in the area of returning children. It is already demonstrating that it can agree and not for nothing. So what can we contribute to the Russian Federation in return for that? Of course, not the abolition of arrest warrants for Putin and Lvova Belova, but we can still hint that if they get the children back to Ukraine, they will have a more favorable situation in this criminal case. Because if the evacuated children are back to Ukraine, it does not provide in these international agreements when exactly these children have to be brought back. They can simply say it was unsafe, now it's safe, and we agreed, they ensured the document, and now the children are back in Ukraine. Another way, the Russian Federation is tired of being a pariah, and it wants once again to be an active participant in the Council of Human Rights under the UN umbrella. So to participate in the negotiations concerning at least this particular document, and we can negotiate from there. No disaster will ensue, and Human Rights Council will not be paralyzed, and international organizations and missions in terms of investigating the crimes, war crimes committed by the Russians in Ukraine are not going to be cancelled. No apocalyptical scripts will be implemented, but this is a very good way to bring the Ukrainian children back to Ukraine. So, dear journalists, are there any more questions to the panelists? I wanted to ask you about this checkpoint in Sumy region. What are the legal foundations for its operations? Is there anything like an agreement between the Ukrainian and Russian authorities? It's question one. And question two, I wonder about the procedure developing concerning the prisoners being brought back to Ukraine across this checkpoint. This checkpoint is operational because the Ukrainian authority needs to ensure for the entry of the Ukrainian citizens, no matter where they are. So the Ukrainian authorities can launch this checkpoint no matter where the Ukrainians would like to get better. Officially, it's not operational as a two-way street, but because we understand that the Ukrainian state, well, this checkpoint was a pedestrian checkpoint just in the middle of a village, meant for pedestrians only, pretty narrow. There are no legal grounds for its operations as far as I know. but the State Border Service recognizes its existence for humanitarian reasons. So it exists because there are humanitarian reasons to bring Ukrainian citizens from the Russian Federation's territory. So this is the first valid reason for its existence. Concerning the procedure of how it takes place, this is a pedestrian crossing. People are allowed from the Russian side, and there are interrogators. The Federal Security Service interrogate the Ukrainian citizens willing to get back to Ukraine, some of them for longer time, some of them for shorter time. Then they're allowed to this checkpoint. If they don't have any documents, these Ukrainian nationals, then there is an interview held, and on the site of the State Border Service, there is information that if such individuals have problems with documents, they go through an interview, and there is a special decision that needs to be issued by a responsible person of the State Border Service. So this is a military expediency to have this particular checkpoint. It's operational, functional, and I believe that for a lot of people who are right now in the temporarily occupied territories, this is the last resort for them to leave those territories and get back to Ukraine. From the standpoint of law, this checkpoint must and can exist because we have a legal norm in the international humanitarian law concerning these humanitarian corridors. You think it's a checkpoint, but in a way it's a humanitarian corridor via which civilian population can get back from Russian occupied territories to Ukrainian territories. Stolislav Vik, V'язень Кремля journalist. At this stage, in terms of getting the Ukrainian nationals back, the ones who have been deported, who are you working with? Russian human rights organizations, maybe Ukrainian nationals in the Russian Federation, who used to be middlemen, negotiators in the past, who have a slightly different perspective on the Ukraine's future. Citizens of Ukraine who have already accepted the Russian citizenship, because there are quite a few. The ones who are unwilling to get back to Ukraine have become citizens of Ukraine and fit in with the system which is in Russia. Thank you for the question. I suppose I will start with the adults, and then I will give the floor to Kateryna if she wants to speak about children. When talking about adults, we also speak about the choice of the adult people if they are willing to get back. The main idea is that the state, the government, needs to enable this window of opportunity for people to come back. So if people have a difficulty with documents, identity documents, they can leave either the territory of the Russian Federation to the third countries or to get back to the territory of Ukraine. There are international organizations helping them to do so. An international organization can cover the travel expenses, buying tickets, and there is no need for them to have the representation in the territory of the Russian Federation. This may be the case directly working with the Russian Federation in terms of bringing civilians back. No, we are not working like this directly. There were temporary collective points. We didn't work with the Russians because for a variety of reasons, Russians helped the deported Ukrainians in the territory of the Russian Federation themselves. The only thing that we will definitely have to work with the Russians, just like on the issue with the children, it's the prisoners and their return to Ukraine, the detainees. Because it's not a secret that the Russian Federation, by different assessments, from 2,500 to 3,500 people from Kherson region have been deported to the Russian Federation territory. So there are difficulties. Once these people have done their imprisonment, they will have to be discharged. But in fact, they are not discharged. They are immediately arrested again and placed in migration prisons because they have seemingly violated the legislation of the Russian Federation. And in this respect, we will also have to speak to the Russian Federation concerning how to bring back these people to Ukraine. So these are international organizations that have nothing to do with Russia. They are based in Georgia or beyond the borders of Russia. Concerning children, here the collaboration takes place at the level of the managers of different institutions where the children are kept. So if they are picked up from the upbringing, camps of upbringing, then we have to be in direct connection with the management of these camps. If these children are picked up from the families, then we have to get in touch with the caretaking services. We also have to be in touch with the caretaking services if it's not their mother or father, but another legal representative come into Russia to pick them up with the legal documents. Concerning NGOs and volunteering organizations, this may be, and this has already taken place, but these are single or very sporadic cases, and these individuals only help the parents who go to pick up their kids. Different combinations may also be possible when they help us to identify the place of residence of these children, which is also a frequent opportunity. Taking this opportunity, I would like to promote the following thing. The local Ukrainian authority, together with the partnership media, they have developed a Telegram channel via which Russians can get through to them and speak about the whereabouts of these children. So we can call these Russian citizens volunteers. However, we have never received any other support from them. An NGO from the Russian Federation approaching us and promising partnership, no, we've never had that. Another important role falls with the journalists, but not Russian journalists, but the journalists accredited in the Russian Federation, being representatives of the international media. They are also helpful to identify the whereabouts of these deported children and obtain the necessary information to bring them back. That's it. We don't have any more contacts at any level. Just like I mentioned, at the commissioner's level, Lvova-Belova, we only get in touch with her if there are excessive cases provoked by the office of Maria Lvova-Belova itself. A short comment from Onisia, a brief remark to make concerning the individuals. So to say obtaining Russian citizenship, you have to understand, my fellow speakers have already spoken about the forcible passportization, both in the Russian Federation and occupied territories. Quite often people there are very much restricted in terms of their opportunities to live or leave these territories. They do not have any possibility to draw on medical assistance if they don't have the Russian passport. There are even cases when people couldn't buy tickets to go to third countries unless they had the Russian citizenship passport, let alone the legislation. When the Russian legislation allows, for example, a child, his caretakers, or if they are in an institution, these children can be issued with the Russian citizenship, and the decisions are taken not by the children themselves because they're still under 18. So when talking about this imposed citizenship, we still have to be keenly aware that Ukraine, of course, will never recognize this acceptance of such citizenship because these are our citizens and we have to think about how to get them back to Ukraine. We thank our citizens, our speakers. We have been speaking about how to bring Ukrainian nationals to Ukraine. Media and Ukrinform will get back to you on Friday. Watch our announcement and thank you for staying with us.